It's obviously a real privilege to deliver this address. I've admired SEPT for many years, as anybody has who's interested in Indian higher education. When Bimalji asked me whether I would be interested, I was obviously completely floored, but I was also taken aback for two reasons. One is that it wasn't so long ago that I was a student. And the only thing I remember about convocation addresses is that they were devastatingly boring. And I couldn't sort of wait to really get my degree and run. And the second is that I wondered what I might be able to say to, to students sort of like me, but who had actually studied something very different, right? And often when I meet people, or historically when I've met people, they sort of, would meet me and say, look, how is it that you can spend so much time thinking about the Constitution? And I'm often sort of, my instinct is to say one of two things to them. The first is that, well, I don't spend that much time thinking about the Constitution, surely. I mean, none of us are that boring. And the second is that I sort of look at them and I say, well, why aren't you doing the same? And I think that I'd like to sort of just take off a little bit from that, and begin sort of with a very basic thought that, look, in some ways, none of your, or very little, I think, of your formal training has probably related to thinking about the Constitution in any serious and sort of academic, professional way. And I hope it hasn't, right? Because if you've been thinking about that, you haven't been thinking about what you've actually been studying at SEP, right? Which are other things. But the reality of our modern lives is that whether or not we are interested in the law is interested in us, and there's no sort of escaping that. And I think part of, at least, the moment of graduating is that you're not only becoming or thinking about actually what you might do next, but you're also exiting a certain kind of private life or a certain kind of isolated educational existence and entering a certain kind of public or different kind of role. And ultimately, all of us are not really sort of I mean, all of us are in some sense students at one stage or another. But I think what is interesting is that all of us are citizens, right, at our core. And I want to just speak a little bit about what that means, and what that actually sort of, why that's significant, and why, and how we should think about both why the Indian Constitution matters and what should worry us, or what should concern us, or what should interest us. And I think we could begin by a very simple story, right? In the middle of the 19th century, if you think about it, most countries in the world were not actually democracies. And if somebody told you that any country could be a democracy and you were around in 1850, people would say that you're mad. And 100 years later, there's nobody who really believes that no country cannot be a democracy. So suddenly the idea becomes universal 100 years later. And what is the interesting historical moment that marks that shift? And the answer is the Indian Constitution. And basically, you have this one moment where actually people are willing to say that, unlike in the American Revolution, where, the question was, can democracy exist anywhere? Here, the question was, can democracy exist everywhere? And I don't sort of want to go into aspects of, what the Indian founding was about and what it wasn't. And much of that is boring, much of that is technical, and it'll become like every convocation I've attended. But I do want to say three things I think that are interesting, right? And I think that are interesting for our lives in general. The first is that actually a lot of citizenship isn't just about how we relate to the state, but it's actually how we relate to each other. And so that's something that's actually quite significant. That citizenship is ultimately about reconstituting the relationship between, say, you and me. It's not just about reconstituting the relationship between states. I think the second, which is at least for me the most interesting and fascinating part about the Indian constitutional founding, is that the project of politics is constantly being created and recreated. So, when a lot of the world told India's founders that, look, India can't be a democracy because it's poor, it's illiterate, it has people of all these various types, it has all these divisions, the Indian answer was that you can create democratic politics, you can create democratic citizens through democratic politics. That actually politics itself can create the people that you want to create. And so if you think you're going to get those people before politics, you're putting the cart before the horse. And similarly, in our world today, that hasn't changed. The kind of people that we get in our world are the kind of people who we seek to get and who we seek to create. And so when we run a certain kind of politics, we'll get a certain kind of people. And when we run a certain kind of a different kind of politics, we'll get a different kind of people. And so part of what's, I think, very interesting and important about that is it reminds us that what's special about the modern world, unlike the medieval world or the ancient world, is that we actually make it. We actually create it. And in some sense, that's why education is so powerful, because you actually live and think that you can actually create and recreate the world around you. That fundamentally, the lives that we lead, we are not just choosing the people we want to marry or the books we want to read or the films we want to watch. We are actually choosing the terms of our collective existence. We're choosing the terms of our sort of public life in a deeper way. And that world is constantly mutable. We can change it, we can destroy it, we can remake it. And that is actually what's scary, what's promising, what's interesting about modernity. And I think the thing about constitutions is that we already do so much of what constitutions aspire to do in our private lives, right? We make plans, we have certain kinds of rules, we actually want to change certain things. And all that constitutions are doing is that they are doing that in some sense in a larger, more significant fashion. But I think that in a way, what's very important for us to remember is that when India sort of when Indians challenged the logic of colonialism, right? They actually challenged it by saying that you could actually completely change how people would be through politics itself, through new kinds of knowledge and power. And that's ultimately what you've got in the last few years, right? You've got certain new kinds of knowledge, you've got certain new kinds of power, and that you can act, that there is something like a democratic citizen who's always coming into being. And that kind of person is never created, right? That kind of person is, it's like a plant that you constantly and consistently keep watering. And when we think about why that's significant today, one needn't get into sort of aspects of Indian politics now or aspects of Indian politics later. That's often not the most sort of interesting way to do it. But I think that at least for me, part of what is an interesting way to do it is that we have to realize that what's significant around the world that we inhabit is a certain kind of constructivism, is the idea that even people we don't like are actually trying to remake the world. And that's an inspiring thought, because it's a reminder of the fact that the world can be remade. And I think that, in a sense, the scariest thing or the most worrying thing, perhaps, in our time, right, or in any time, isn't extremism, but a certain kind of cynicism, a certain kind of belief that, look, the world actually has certain terms and conditions, and we have to live within them, or we have to conform to them, or we have to sort of, those are the rules that actually bind us and that we can't change. And I think in some sense that's a fundamentally anti-constitutional thought, because what it means to think about constitutionally is that you can fully change the world. But unlike you would do with war, constitutions allow you to do it peacefully. And so constitutions are actually ways to peacefully, completely re-alter the world, but they are still fundamentally world-making activities. And that's why, I mean, that's one of the reasons why the Indian Constitution was, in some sense, such a fundamental text, right? It was a kind of pedagogical apparatus that brought into being a certain kind of citizen. And we are always going to have situations where we don't, we are always going to be in societies, wherever we live, at whatever age we live, where simply because we have constitutions that we might like, we don't get the politics we want, right? And of course, that's going to be true because constitutions are never sufficient for the kind of world that we inhabit, right? But I think part of what's important for all of us, right, not just for boring lawyers like me, but actually for every single person, is that recognizing that, in a sense, modern political life, right, will obviously be a playground of all kinds of rational, irrational beliefs and contexts and so on and so forth. But what's significant is that any kind of sort of constitutional change or any kind of political movement is itself a mark of possibility. And I think, at least for me, the most exciting thing about getting an education, and I think that's what's been, I mean, all of you have got an incredible education, right? You are graduating now from one of the best centers of learning that India has known, not only at the present, but perhaps for decades. And in a way, what's inspiring about having that kind of education isn't what you've learned, or isn't only what you've learned, but the thought that actually that learning is a way to actually alter the world around you. And there are two things that are needed if the world around you has to alter, right? You need to be able to alter the world around you, and that's what education has done or given you. But the world also needs to be capable of being altered, right? And I think part of what we learn from constitutions is that that's actually what people try to do, right? And they may alter it in ways you like, they may alter it in ways you don't like, right? A lot of people did not like the alterations that were brought about in 1950. A lot of people did. A lot of people like what alterations that are being brought about now. A lot of people don't. That's neither here nor there. But what's common to all of these enterprises is the fundamental belief that the world can change. And I think that's what actually makes the enterprise of education, or the pedagogical sort of aspiration, so meaningful. That, in a way, I think the thing that we have to guard against, because we'll always be in situations where we seem to be at an edge, right, where you've sort of hit a roadblock, that there is a way in which the world stares you in the face and you think nothing can be done. And we have to realize that the problem with that thought is that, not that it's conservative or extremist or liberal or illiberal, is it's cynical. And that cynicism is fundamentally anti-constitutionalist. And so I think to believe in constitutions isn't only to believe in the rule of law. It isn't only to believe that if we are all under a single authority like the state, that itself brings about a certain kind of equality because we all are under the same umbrella. It isn't only to believe that look, we should all be accorded dignity as individuals rather than reduced to different groups, because the individualization of identity is what actually enables me to be an agent. Constitutionalism means all of these things, but it also means fundamentally that I can change something, and the world can be changed as a technical and as a meaningful matter. And I think, for me at least, that's been one of the most important things, the one of the most important reasons why education matters and why we are here. And so that's the only sort of very simple thought that I leave you with, that when we think about constitutions, we actually think about constituting the modern world. And the modern world hasn't been constituted just by wars or by colonialism. It's actually been constituted in very dramatic ways by constitutions. Not only earlier, but now. 80% actually of the world's constitutions have been written in the last 50 years, I think. And so these are not small things. And all these people are doing something because they've realized this, right? That this is how we shape our sort of public imagination and collective consciousness. So I leave the thought there. And I just want to thank everybody again, and I want to congratulate you. This is, at least when I've been there, I've always felt that this is one of the most special moments of life, because nothing else counts more. So thank you.